Anyway, I was born and raised in Houston, and then I moved to Austin about 40 years ago. I followed my mom and dad and my sister, and I have a large family. I have two sweet and loving, or had two sweet and loving grandmothers who've passed away. But I never had a grandfather because they both passed away before I was born. But I did, however, have a step-grandfather named Dutch. He was my mother's husband, my mother's mother's husband. And Dutch was never very affectionate. He's not the kind you'd want to sit in his lap and snuggle, and he never really tucked us into bed at night and read us a bedtime story. He is pretty emotionally detached and really only interested in my grandmother. He convinced my grandmother, who's named Renee, we called her Renee, he convinced her to send my mom to her grandmother's to be raised by her grandmother so they could be alone. It's something we never really forgave him for, and my mother definitely never forgave him for. Dutch was a bit of a nitwit. He was a self-proclaimed family photographer, but something would always go wrong. He'd always forget to put the film in the camera, or the batteries would be dead, or he'd get us all lined up for the picture and the dog's sitting still and everybody smiling, and then he'd take the picture with a lens cap on. So even to this day, when we have our family photo done once a year and something goes wrong, we all chime in unison, "Okay, Dutch." He was also a bit of a braggart, and he loved to go on about his days at Texas A&M and how he was a big man on campus. But actually, we found out he had been expelled early on, and we never found out why because he never chose to talk about that. But he also loved to go on about his days in vaudeville. He pulled the curtain in the stage, and he'd tell tall tales about the different celebrities that he knew and how they knew him. And of course, we all took that with a grain of salt until one day when I was 12, he took myself and my mom and Renee and my sister to the Houston Theater in the Round to see Jimmy Durante. So we took our seats, and then he left and came back a few minutes later and asked us to follow him. And we followed him backstage, where he introduced us to that beautiful, bigger-than-life nose, Jimmy Durante, the big schnozzola. I was beside myself. My mouth dropped. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing because I love that man. And Jimmy Durante was such a gentleman. He was so kind-hearted. I really doubt that he remembered the stagehand that pulled the curtain for him 20 years before, but he acted as if he did, and he gave us the royal treatment. Now, when you meet Jimmy Durante, you don't necessarily have to shake his hand. You get the honor of rubbing your nose against his big nose. So there I was. I got to touch my little 12-year-old nose to the most famous nose in the world, the nose of the man who kicked the bucket and buried the treasure under the big W in my favorite movie, and the nose of the man who wished Mrs. Calabash a good night, and the nose of the man with a ha-cha-cha-cha. I was the luckiest sixth grader alive, and I had a story that would top all my friends' stories, and had a story I could tell when I was 64. So, you know, on Jeopardy, the game show, they must ask the contestants in advance to list all the funky things they've done, or the weird foods they've eaten, or the odd way their spouse proposed to them. And then Alex Trebek comes on after the first commercial and goes up to each contestant and talks to them about their funny little experience. So if I was ever smart enough to be on Jeopardy, at the top of my list, circled in red and highlighted in yellow with big arrows pointing to it, would be the fact that I bear the nose that touched the nose of Jimmy Durante. Because even at 64, I'm still proud to say that is my claim to fame. So good night, Jimmy, and good night, Mrs. Calabash.